Thank you,
Okay, recorder's on. I'm going to go ahead and call this meeting of the Anchorage Committee on Homelessness to order. We'll go ahead and start with introductions, starting with Nikki.
I'm Nikki Rose. I'm from the Federation of Community Councils, and I was appointed by the Federation to be on the Homelessness Committee. Thank you.
Christopher Constant, Assembly.
Felix Rivera.
Big Training Assembly.
Nancy Burke, Mayor's Office.
If we can go through the audience, do a quick round, please.
Tom McGrath. Ron Oliva. Anthony Giller, CITC.
Karma Reed, U.S. Department of Housing and Urban
Patrick Anderson, Rural Alaska Community Action Program.
Linda Chase, Ordinary Citizen. Christian Cuddy, State Record Community. Evelyn Ship, University of Alaska. Fiona Johnson, Cultural Center. Here's Snowway.
Jack Burgess, Mississippi Community Alliances.
You want to introduce yourself?
Eric Croft Assembly.
And then we have two folks on the phone. If you want to introduce yourself right quick.
Joshua Spring with the Office of Senator Tom Begich.
And Suzanne LaFrance, Assembly.
All right, thank you. Okay, we'll go ahead and move on to our business items, starting with the Mayor's Housing and Homeless Services Coordination Initiative update.
I am thinking of a way that we might send this to the participants on the phone. Do we have a paper copy?
No, it's just going to be here. While Ms. Burke is doing that, just so I can allocate enough time at the end of the meeting, how many folks are interested in participating in item number 5, audience participation? I have 1, 2. Okay.
Kids on their phones, eh?
What do you do with the future?
Oh, I sent John and Rhonda went to that race they said she's the I think it was on that.
Okay.
So, just to let you know, you have said when I
Yeah.
did this Thursday.
Yeah, thanks.
They found nothing loose on there. They said 2 beefy guys. And I think loose.
Oh, interesting.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The updates that we had from the
initiative. I think it's a good time for me to go back through and just to review some of the big picture work that's been done over the course of the year. I think we've moved away from the broader system view of how things are going and focus on some details that were helpful. But I think it's just a great reminder for all of us that this work we're doing is really pushing a very large system that has many multiple stakeholders. And the change that the community is attempting to make through the mayor's office, the Homeless Coalition, United Way, many of our funders, we're trying to figure out a way to align resources so that we can best prepare for some of the economic circumstances that are happening and make the best use of services that we have in our system. So we're moving from a system that was somewhat disconnected and siloed. Homeless providers and behavioral health providers and substance abuse treatment providers have long existed through grant programs and funding through federal streams that really cause them to operate in their own regulatory environment and world. And so we're trying to push this system into one that moves from prioritization being focused around qualifications for services according to each fund source or each agency to what does the community need and how do we prioritize throughout the community of what will probably always be not enough resources. How do we have a coordinated outreach system and prioritization? How do we focus on the right housing and the right services at the right time and achieve those unified community goals?
And before you continue, Ms. Burke, I just see some folks standing. There are some chairs back here that are open. And then if you'd like to sit, there are some chairs here at the table that are also open. Thank you. You can continue, Ms. Burke.
If you think back to the chart that we've reviewed before, where there are a number of different population areas, we've talked many times in this committee about the fact that my work in the mayor's office has been focused on the place where we really experience the most pressure in the community, and that's around adult homelessness. And so these columns that we've talked quite a bit about before really are the focus for the way that we're framing the work for adult homelessness in the community in partnership with all those other resources and agencies that provide homeless services. But for the first time in the community, we're really linking together public safety and our parks resources with a coordinated entry or coordinated outreach approach. We're looking at a total number of homeless people in the community and trying to plan around their needs for safety and for resources. We're now pushing out and looking at housing. What's our housing stock? How is that matching up to the need that we've been able to establish over the course of the last 3 years? And then finally, how do we coordinate resources so that people stabilize in housing? And when you start working at that part of the continuum, you also get at how do you prevent people from coming into homelessness? It becomes both a stabilization and prevention strategy. In the resources that the Assembly's committed, if you think about the mobile intervention team, the overflow shelter funding, and those first two commitments that came through the funding, the budget line this year, are focused on the first three columns. We really need more work in this area. We need the outreach. We need the resources connected to people who are camping or on the street or the public safety aspects, connecting that to the coordination of resources and the planning for safety. That's what the first two allocations that the Assembly and the Mayor provided together begin to do. We're adding additional resources to overflow, as we'll talk about in a few minutes. But these investments are helping us to stabilize this whole system. And I try to emphasize that every time I'm speaking with a reporter or speaking with a group in the community.
that it is a whole system. If you don't work that entire continuum, you will just have a bottleneck in a different location up the line. The last one is the elder stabilization project is one that begins to help us push into the area of housing. How are the needs of the people or the populations that we're seeing in shelter or in the community matching up to the resources that we have for housing? And we know generally we can say there is a lack of resources to get people to housing. We used to say that there was a vacancy issue, that there, the market was tight, and that we were unable to move people to units. The market is softening. There is a higher vacancy rate now. It's been reported between 5 and 10% for the rental market for units that we would be looking at for this population. And so while that is easing, the unit availability is easing, the rental resources and subsidies are not easing. So we now have units, and when people can quickly transition to a unit and return to work, we think there'll be a lot of opportunities to take advantage of a lower vacancy rate than we've had in the past. Higher vacancy rate, excuse me. So the elder stabilization project is one way that we will be able to look at a population that we know is overrepresented in shelter, and we will begin using this resource to determine how we can help those members transition out to community and what that looks like for people who are 55 or 65 and older in this community. To get to that number, one of the things that we do every year in January, and one of the requested data items on the agenda by Assembly members was, what are our numbers? We know that we've just done a point-in-time count. This slide is a depiction of last year's point-in-time count, which is the most complete year that we have. While our count was conducted in January, there is a process that the data goes through to ensure that we are not double counting people who may have been encountered in a school setting, in a shelter setting, in multiple locations across the community. And that takes time to unduplicate that data and to ensure that we have the right number. As a reminder, this is a snapshot count. This is how many people were homeless in the community in January, the last Wednesday of January 2017, and for all populations. That includes families, adults, veterans, youth. Our number last year was 1,128. And so you can see how we compare to some of the other communities, and you can see at the bottom that we are roughly double the number of the national count for homelessness. That's why this work is important, and I think that's why this committee and the administration and our partners are so focused on it.
Ms. Brooke, I have a question from Mr. Trainee.
Ms. Brooke, how many elders are we talking about? You talked about elder stabilization. How many are we talking about? And where are you looking to put them? And what are the resources we've got to put them there?
So this resource is the initial, oftentimes when you're working a project and you're trying to figure out how to address housing in the community, you have to know, it's a bit of a back and forth process. You have to know, well, what are the people's needs? Then you know what the service plan looks like. Then you can look at what the unit configuration may look like or what's available, and then you can plan the project. That's the best way to go into a project. Sometimes opportunities come up and you work around a building instead. We're not doing that with this project. We're starting with the population. We're going to go and assess the elders. When you look at the data for people who are over 65 in the community, it's roughly 25% of the shelter population. That's across the Brother Francis Shelter and the Anchorage Gospel Rescue Mission Shelter. We haven't asked that question of the other, of Awake or some other emergency resources, but the two main shelters, about 25%. If you move that to 55, and we've just asked this question of the Brother Francis Shelter, people 55 and over on a one-day snapshot count conducted by Catholic Social Services, that number was 100 people. So 100 of 240 are 55 and older at the Brother Francis shelter. It brings us into a conversation about elder services and that siloing that we were talking about. There are programs for elders. There's, there are in-home meals that are delivered. There's in-home care that happens for elders. It's not a service system that we have connected to our homeless networks at this time, but that will be what this resource will allow us to do, using some consultants to both assess what would the elders need if they were in the community right now. Could we support them out in senior units? Would we have to have a program that had on-site staffing, or could we use other senior resources to help them stabilize in the community? Those are all questions that we will go into in this project.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Trini. Go ahead.
And thank you for the time and money to do it, because these are new questions for us. It's a new area, so thank you for that. So then if we look at how Anchorage and the balance of state, and if we look at Alaska totals, this is how we break out by populations. On this slide, it's titled Measuring Progress, the 2017 one-day count. And again, remember, this is a snapshot of one day, so over the course of the year, there are different people moving in and out of the system. But on our one-day count, we had 1,100 in Anchorage. I want to say that the balance of state number is not represented well, because the way that families and communities Melina said she would come up if I needed anything, so I said she'll come. Okay. The way that homelessness looks in rural Alaska is different. People double up. People are in housing that's not sufficient for families in particular, and so this number we should all use with an abundance of caution that this is how it actually looks. But you can see that the issues in Anchorage are clear for everyone, and that Anchorage is struggling with homelessness. So then we go into looking at, so how are we going to look in 2018? This chart we will be able to fill this chart out and have this back to you. If we give enough time for the data count to go through and the unduplication and the submission of the federal report, we think that the April meeting we can focus and go deeper on what our shelter numbers look like and what this trend looks like. Last year we were sort of excited, cautiously optimistic maybe, to see that we went from 2016 to 2017 for adults who were sheltered. We had a small tick down in that number. It really depends a lot on how well your community canvas can cover the area, what temperature it is on that day. So there is some reason to be cautious about seeing those numbers trend in a direction, but we do hope to continue to see some progress in these numbers. And then to talk about the methodology, this is the piece I wanted to get to. So in the past 2 years, 2016 and 17, we began using the GIS mapping data and to tracking where the community members were reporting camps into our community portal, where the outreach teams were finding people who needed assistance and finding camps in the community, and really getting better about canvassing and understanding what it looks like out in the broader community areas of people camping or on the street. So in 2016, we conducted a methodology that included using GIS mapping, but for the first time. We used 190 volunteers that year. We really spanned as much of the community as we could, and we found 118 people. In 2017, we used the same methodology, but we had more reliance on the GIS mapping information. We knew that it was becoming more robust. We have a couple of years of operation with it, and we could use it to guide our outreach. So we had 150 volunteers still canvassing the community in a very broad way, looking for people who were homeless and interviewing them, and that's when we came up with 79. this year, we used a methodology that is somewhat of an overlap. We used more GIS data. It's more similar to what we did in the summer of 2017, which I'll go to next. But it is a hybrid of this straight, just sending sheer bodies out to Canvas in the community and using GIS data to guide it. We used more GIS data to guide it. So and we also were able to do it during a time that was not 4 a.m., which helps with our volunteer recruitment. We did 6 to 10 p.m., and we canvassed the same quadrants around the community. We utilized the outreach workers and the CAP team to do all of the areas where we had a higher volume of camp notifications over now 3 years of data. And then we used community volunteers to canvass more broadly in the areas that we didn't have as much density on our GIS data. So it was a hybrid. We had about 60 volunteers come out. They really, it was pretty cold on that night. They stayed out for pretty much from 6 to 10 and conducted the canvass in that manner. And so you see our preliminary number that we came up with is 94 for that.
Thank you, Ms. Burke. Mr. Croft.
So, Nancy, I'm still struggling. You and I have had conversations about it, about how to read those numbers as the problem you are facing or the impact you are having. I read the total adults as what's come in, that is the problem you're facing, and the transitional housing as what we've been able to place. But I take it you treat it differently. That is, I mean, isn't the first line a measure of the difficulty, the problem, and transitional housing a measure of what we've done about it?
Yes.
The sheltering is fine. Traditional housing is the ultimate thing we want, and non-transitional housing is the ultimate thing we want, just housing.
That's correct. Thank you for pointing that out. And this is another component of a mix of these are the federal grant categories, and traditionally HUD has had you count the total adults who are sheltered and unsheltered. You count your sheltered adults. Transitional housing was a grant program that HUD supported for many, many years when we were using the stair-step model that we've described. You go from shelter to transitional out to community, and now communities are just flipping it and just using resources to get people out and stabilized. So while this column remains in the count, it will continue. This will continue to go down because there's no money for it. All of the resources shifting to permanent housing through those grant programs. And so you're correct. These folks are stabilized. However, if they transition out and can't make it into permanent housing and come back in the community, returns to homelessness will be something that we will monitor.
Where is the line of people we've put in permanent housing that haven't popped back into our system yet?
This, if you think about those, it's not here. It's on a different chart that we need to get.
If it's coming up, that's great. But so another way to read line 1, right, is it went down because we put 62 people into permanent housing. Or it went down because 62 fewer people this year came. The problem is smaller, or we cured the problem. And I don't know still which way to read column 1.
I think that we don't have enough data, and we haven't been doing this enough to give you the exact answer. But we can, I think what we can say is the pushes we're making on targeting people who are cycling through higher level emergency services, targeting outreach and engagement for people in the community generally and in other communities has pushed this number down, and we have to keep moving on it. While our data system, remember our data system really officially launched in a more robust way last January. So the HMIS system, and it is beginning to give us that data and report it out, but it's still...
I'll let you move on. I know you got a lot of others. Every time I try and ask questions about what the data means, I get back, the data isn't very good. And at some point, we got to have good enough data that I can draw some policy conclusion out of it. If transitional housing is not a measure of success anymore, because it's just a program winding down, I need the other measure of success. If adult sheltered is not for want of a better word, a failure, that is, we don't really want them in shelters, we want them in housing, then I need a better way to see whether what we're doing is working and what specific aspects of what we're doing are working. And I know it's difficult, but I keep not getting data I can even rely on. When I say, what does the data mean, I get the data isn't very good, or it isn't very reliable, or it isn't very comparable year to year. And that doesn't help me do my job. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I need to interrupt for just a second. There is a white Dodge Durango in the mayor's spot, license plate FTY892. If it's any of yours, you need to move it before it gets towed.
Unless you're the mayor.
That's not what
He doesn't drive.
I know.
Thank you, sorry.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Croft. I think Mr. Constant might be able to enlighten us.
Just a little bit. So the point of this chart is this is a report required by the feds. And so there's a separate set of information that can help us get to your point, Eric, that this number set will always look like this because the way the feds require us to count it. And so, but then we can actually state how many vouchers are being used. We can state calls for service that are going down for various EMS services. And so while this report right here won't ever get you that information you're looking for, because this isn't our report, we're just filling in this report for our federal requirements, right? There's other information that will get us closer to what you want, I think. And so that the limitation of this is what we're required. So that's at least how I understand it.
Mr. Chair, may I?
Sure. Go ahead.
I'm actually not willing to take myself off of that hook because you're absolutely right. And I can tell you the reason why the way that I use this data to make program decisions and decisions in the absence of a really solid data dashboard. First of all, I'm just going to say, you are correct. We need that data dashboard. We need all these resources combined together. And there's some partnership opportunities coming up that I think will help us get everybody on the same page to do that. We have to have it for policy, and we have to have it for advocacy. But in this chart, there are two columns that I pay most attention to, and it's this one, because we are physically viewing how many people are in our community, and it's this one, total adults. Total adults and total people outside. That tells me two things. That tells us how much emergency resource we need, and it tells us also how many vouchers, how many units, and in what configuration. And some of that work is starting to actually move forward, and we'll be bringing that to you in the next couple of months. But I completely agree with your point. It's absolutely right. We need a dashboard that a policymaker can use that doesn't drive him crazy every time we talk about it.
Thank you.
We took this column out. I just want to say that this is one of the methodology changes that happened. We took this using Project Homeless Connect as a data source for those two goals of knowing how many people need shelter and how many people are sleeping outdoors. That's a resource fair. I think we talked about that. People come in, they fill out a survey, where did you sleep last night? And they say, well, I slept outside. But we don't visibly see them sleeping outside. That's why I'm so stuck on this column, and the sheltered and the unsheltered columns are really the best available data points. That
Can you explain that last column really quickly?
This column?
Yeah, what it
Just the
means.
94.
This is what we got when our 60 volunteers went out this time, and we saw 94 people in the community. It has not completely been vetted through the data process, but that's what, so last year we saw 79 when we went out with all of our volunteers. This year we saw 94. Which
Thank you.
I view as a holding our own, because as you've also pointed out, Eric, and I think it's absolutely right, that we can't, it's not a sure thing. It's not, there's a margin of error in that count as well. Okay, so then the question was asked at the assembly, and this is another methodology explanation, and I too hope that we have this solid now, and that future
people sitting in all of our seats will just use this same methodology, and we'll have years and years of data to compare it to. But using the old snapshot data from the winter count, when we did the summer count in August of 2016, we saw 602 people in those two data areas that I pointed out, sheltered and visually viewed outdoors or on the street, and 209 of them were unsheltered. So using input, we knew that this methodology wasn't adequate for summer. We knew there had to be a change. The police were telling us, you're not going deep enough, you're not capturing what you need to capture. And so if you recall last year when we did the summer, we changed it. This is our baseline number. We're using the GIS data. We're using name and date of birth for all but a pretty small percentage of the people. We looked at panhandling. We looked at all the locations we could find, and the CAT team helped us go deep into the places where they knew camps were around the community. We also expanded to Eagle River and Girdwood. So this, using those two data points that I think are critical for policy decisions, sheltered and unsheltered, 1,263 was our summer count. So going forward, when we go back to when this chart is complete, one of the things that I think our partners were all queued up and ready to do is put this chart into this framework. What do we need for public safety in parks? What resources, what data are we getting? What do we have for coordinated entry? What are our emergency cold weather and overflow and shelter resources that are needed? What is the housing that we need, including rental subsidies, and what resources do we need to help people stay stabilized? This is the framework that data dashboard should come in as. We should be giving you those data points so that as we move forward through the year, I think we have advocacy to do with our state partners. I think there's probably some federal changes that are coming through that could really unhinge, or federal changes being discussed that could unhinge the progress we're making. And so that having this data available is our top priority. And then the last part of my report is just a reminder that we have a lot of people, and like our Olympians, we are better together. We can do this if we can get everybody pulling in the same direction.
Thank you. All right. Any questions for Ms. Burke on her report? Okay, seeing none, thank you, Ms. Burke. We'll go ahead and move on in our agenda. Okay, so we already did B, correct, in your report, Ms. Burke?
We did, yes.
All right. Great. Well, then we'll go ahead and move on to the emergency cold weather shelter update.
I just found out what I'm going to be talking about. The shelter update, in November of last year, we were working with our local nonprofits to fund, for one of the first times appropriately, fund to an adequate level the overflow shelters, both at the downtown Sioux Kitchen Hope Center and Eames Cafe. We were able to fund downtown Soup Kitchen, but the deal that we tried to work with the other provider didn't work. So we were scrambling to find a substitute provider, and one of the things that I looked at was the activity at the Anchorage Safety Center and Safety Patrol. The numbers, I think we've reported previously, have gone down significantly over the years. And looking at those numbers, it looked as if we had human people that could be reallocated to work in monitoring the shelters. So we worked with Securitas, our contractor, and were able to amend their contract to allow them to provide shelter services over at Beans Cafe since I think November 18th. Since we've done that, the census at the shelter has been significant. I think we were anticipating 40 to 50 individuals. They staffed it with 4, so we were able to fund it. 1 EMT and then 3 monitors. The numbers that we've been seeing have been significantly over that. Typically 60 a night, as high as 85 some nights. One of the things that we do have is a backup plan for the entire contract, and that is we've got van service, we've got obviously staff over at the safety center, and then the staff at Beans, the overflow shelter. The priority is that we maintain our Title 47 requirements at the safety center, so that that's always open and we're always able to receive clients that need that service in protective custody and out of harm's way. One of the things that we do, and one of the things that is done when we start exceeding that 10-to-1 ratio, is we pull a van on the safety patrol, and we have had to pull vans about 90% of the time. Typically, we have one van running 24 hours a day, and then between 1900 and 0300 hours, we've got a second van. But we've been pulling one of those 2 vans to help staff the the Beans overflow. I think there have been a couple times where we've used the backup plan and pulled both vans, and in that scenario, the police transport over to the safety center. There have been a couple days that has occurred. And we of course talked to the police department ahead of time and let them know that potential existed. There have been a few times where the police have done transports between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the morning. Not large numbers. That's typically a low period of time for pickups. But the demand for this for the shelter has been pretty significant since we started. I know we funded the shelter the past couple of years, and we did not see those numbers in previous years. Now it's been cold, 10 degrees, everybody's off the streets and put in a safe environment.
Okay. If I can pause you right quick, I have a question. Mr. Constant.
Yeah, just clarification. It's not the Beans overflow. I just want the record to be explicitly clear.
Brother Francis over.
No, it's the municipality's overflow that we're operating, that we're paying a lease to Beans Cafe to operate. I just want the public to be well aware that Beans Cafe is only generating revenue in the process of allowing that to happen. It's not actually operating.
Correct.
So, thank you.
That's right.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Go
I
ahead.
have one clarifying point on that to Mr. Constant's comment.
Sure.
Lisa from Beans Cafe. We were allowing the city to lease the space because no other suitable facility could be found. I just want to clarify that.
No, that's absolutely true, and we lease the space to Beans for $1 a year, and we pay them $8,000 a month to run the cold weather shelter in it. So I just want the public to understand we are operating it, Beans is not.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Do you have anything further, Mr. Ashman?
No, that's it.
Okay.
I hope the weather warms up real quick.
Any questions for Mr. Ashman on the emergency cold weather shelter update? Sure.
I just can't remember. How long will the cold weather shelter be open? Is it in the March? Or do you know yet? I mean, we did clean up the weather, so I just can't remember.
Well, I can tell you how long it's funded through.
Yes.
I can't tell you what the weather's going to do. I believe it is March 31st, so on April 1st, they would cease operations. We don't have sufficient funds to go on beyond that. It's a 6-month period.
Okay. Thank you. Sure.
Steve, you said that the comment was that you had funded this in previous years and didn't see the need as it was this year.
Start over, I'm sorry.
You said that you had funded this with us previous years and didn't see the same need as you do this year. The need didn't fund us last year for emergency cold shelter.
Thank you. You must be from Beans also.
Yes, I want to be sure it's clear.
We funded Catholic Social Services, very small amount of money, it was like $16,000 a year for overflow services over at Beans.
Thank you. We're going to go ahead and move on. I'll get you at the end, Mr. Oliva. So we'll do the mobile intervention team update.
May I jump back one quick thing? I forgot to give an update on the Project Homeless Connect event when I was covering that we're no longer collecting data for the official camp. I did not want to represent that event is not happening and that it's not an important part of what we're doing, because in fact, at the Project Homeless Connect event, the coalition decided to maintain a commitment to this event and bring resources together, and there were 704 people who came to Project Homeless Connect this year. In my mind, it's become not only a resource fair for people who are currently homeless, but those looking for information to prevent homelessness or additional resources. And so this event will continue to be supported in the community. There's a list of services that happen here that's a full page. We'd like to provide a report on the event at one of the future meetings. But just to highlight, there were 415 referrals and discussions about housing or options for shelter. There were 9 housing providers and programs represented. 92 applications were submitted for housing at that event. State IDs, birth certificates were, applications were available. There were just a lot of really needed services for the community. So I didn't want to represent that event in my report, although we will not be using a self-report assessment of individuals at Project Homeless Connect to help us with our data.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Burke. All right.
Okay, so the mobile intervention team, this was one of those projects that we had a really nice meeting on last time. We are beginning to not only look at the needs of people who are at Brother Francis Shelter and Beans Cafe for emergency resources. We're not only looking at age, we're looking at specific populations and the level of care, and we're of course seeing a much higher level of care of individuals down in this location than we have historically. I think this will come together with the item where we're going to talk about changes in rental resources and the COC, that we have seen a decrease in the outreach and availability of funding for people who have a severe mental illness in our community to gain housing. And that is apparent to the mobile intervention team. I think we were able to talk last time in depth about the fact that we're using a combination of a public safety and clinical approach to looking at the campus. We're using this team to stabilize particularly individuals who are staying in the parking lot, who are moving across the street to Carla, up the street. And we've implemented some procedures that will help to engage those people or to disperse them from that location, so that we can get a better idea of what's happening for services and how we can align resources for Beans Cafe and Brother Francis in that area. So the updates from the team, I think we can highlight that we continue to see our police department calls going down. In January when we started, there were about 62 calls for the very first week that we operated. And then we went into the 40s with 44 and 41 over the next 3 weeks. We jumped back up to 49 and 57 as we ended January and began February, and then last week the calls were at 39. So as we move policies and procedures and as the flow of people changes through campus, there is a monthly flow of people who will come and go as they receive checks at the beginning of the month. There can be some different changes that happen around that time, and so we will continue to work with these the changes and work with the nonprofits to ensure that we have a permanent change. This is not the case that we're just dispatching the police and that they're fixing it, if you will. This is a coordinated effort with the nonprofits to make changes that will be lasting and sustainable at this location. The fire department numbers also report that we are down about 70 calls from last year at this time. So across the two municipal agencies, we continue to see very great progress on this project. I think that Lisa were willing to talk with us about what that meant for their agencies and some of the changes that they're stepping up with, and so I just wanted to give them a couple of minutes to describe that.
Thank you. First of all, I want to really say thank you to APD, CAP team, and to AFD. They were a great resource to have on campus, and we appreciate the partnership. We definitely saw a significant impact, especially when they were physically on campus, but also just the effect of them being able to work side by side with our staff and with Brother Francis' staff was really important. I think it led to a lot better relationships between folks that many times only see each other in a crisis situation, and it's sometimes hard to develop a good working relationship in those settings. So I think it really did a lot to improve safety for everybody due to that. A couple of the changes that we're making at Beans Cafe, we are instituting a bag search policy and not allowing unsealed water bottles of any kind into the cafe. We will also be bracketing people based on suspicion of intoxication, so we know when it's appropriate to call for ASP to pick them up. Those are things that we've worked really closely with the Mobile Intervention team and with APD and AFD to implement. We're training all of our staff on those procedures right now. I think that that's really going to make a difference for us, but I think we need to not lose sight of the big picture, that we have a lot of seriously mentally ill people and people with severe addiction issues that we're still not addressing the right issue of. You know, we don't have more treatment yet, we don't have more mental health facilities, and we can kind of keep, you know, changing policies and doing things to provide as safe an environment as possible, but we really do need to address those underlying conditions, and that's going to take not just the community, as we know, but really the state and federal government as well. But I just don't want us to lose sight of that we have really lost a lot of resources, especially on the mental health side for homeless and vulnerable adults, and that definitely has had an impact on campus. And if anybody would like to come down, I'm always welcome. Lisa and I are happy to give tours of Brother Francis and Beans. We're happy to talk to you at any time. My cell phone number is literally on my office phone. If you call my office phone, you'll get my phone number if I'm not in the office. Please call me if you have any questions at any time.
Thank you.
Hi. Yes, I'll stand up since Lisa is. Hi, everyone. I'm just here to talk a little bit about Brother Francis Shelter and how we are partnering with the MIT team. That has been really helpful and really successful, and we're really appreciative for the added resources to this issue. When I think back about sort of what has led up to this, in 2015 at Brother Francis Shelter, we did a long look at our data, and we found that between 2005 and 2015 there was a 30% increase in people using Brother Francis Shelter, and that's when we found that senior data too. We found that data, there was a 240% increase in seniors using the shelter, and that is going to continue to rise. But we haven't seen the number of people using the shelter increase a lot after 15. It's about 3,600 people a year. So it increased for a while, and so in response to that, we at Brother Francis Shelter really tried to look around and say, how can we know we need to change, because the model we were using 5 years ago isn't going to help with more people. So we've done a lot of work in the past few years to try to change that. We've added staff. We are now open all day and all night. We've added security. We've gone to a trauma-informed model on campus. We've also partnered with all the hospitals to bring a lot more services down into the area. And I just want to talk about that for a second, because that has had an impact on the calls. So we had an incredible report from our partner South Central Foundation, who runs our clinic. And our clinic opened at the end of March. And since that time, we've seen about 1,350 people at the clinic. They have seen them. Even if we estimate that 10 or 15% of those were calls that were not 911 calls because they went to their clinic, that's 200 calls that didn't happen. So those are the kinds of numbers that unfortunately AFD is not going to be able to give to you. But I'm telling you that the stuff that we're doing is making a difference. It's making an impact. I'm really proud of our partners and really proud of all of our staff at Brother Francis Shelter and Lisa for the work that they've done. Working with the MIT team has just been another layer of support and partnership, and we're really grateful for that. I think for us, just the additional support for our clients, because there's a lot of people outside who are sort of, they're technically our clients because they're always welcome to use our services, but there's a lot of people outside that are just not interested in using our services. They don't want to come in and do that, but they do want to stay in that area. So we really appreciate them working with us, connecting with those folks, getting folks who are dangerous to other people or themselves to the right places and not in our area. So we appreciate the city and all of you putting resources towards that, because as I've said before here, you know that almost 90% of the Brother Francis Shelter for emergency shelter budget is from donations from the public. We don't get very much from the government to run our service. So we really appreciate the partnership with the government on services like the MIT team. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, any questions?
This one for Lisa.
Sure.
Man, who does your security? What company does your security?
Phoenix is the company that we use.
Okay. How many people does Phoenix, how many are on site there from Phoenix?
I believe there's 2 folks on site.
Okay, thank you. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Sure, Mr. Constant.
Nancy, just last night I drove through, and for the first time since January, there were 2 camps set up, one on Carluck and one on 3rd Avenue. And so just, there's a camp there.
Yeah.
So.
You're the third person to tell me this.
Yep, I drive through all the time. So.
No, it's important, and we are going to stay on that. And we're, there's, it's a challenge organizing 2 different agencies and people like me, and Breland really should get a round of applause from all of us, because she's the one in the middle of it all, keeping us all on track and schedules. And so this week is a week that's a little off for the team. There are some other priorities, and so we will continue to pay attention to it, but we're regrouping, and we have to have some additional things to move forward, and so Steve and I are working on that as well.
Have we noticed the tent?
I'm sorry?
Have we put notice on that tent? Chief.
Lieutenant Sergeant.
Yeah, Lieutenant.
Yes, Lisa reported it to me, I think, this morning, and the team's gonna get out there.
Thank you.
Most of those are on right away. If they're on a sidewalk or on the street locations, they're on a right of way. So we work with the people, but it's quicker than the notification.
Thank you.
And then, of course, to say that the overflow, one of the things is the engaging people, and Lisa's comment about there are people who are not engaging in service, and part of it is probably where those people are. Part of it is there are a number of people who have higher needs, and it's harder for them to come into a high volume, dense location. And so it is not the case that we are just moving people around. We are individually focusing on people to see how can we help you move to your next thing, whatever that is. And so there have really been 2 specific stories, and Alex leaned over and corrected me with the fire data. We're down 101 calls to date. And what this team will begin to do is not only have a systemic view of what's happening at one location or at other locations. If there are problems happening, up the street or at another in a community location, as we move towards summer, this team will be more mobile. Right now, currently, we continue to stabilize the campus and to stabilize the neighboring areas in the eastern part of downtown. But individual focus on people is what's driving the mobile intervention team, and also driving a lot of these calls. And so there have been 2 specific personal stories that have come out of this. One person is the highest caller on AFD's list. And through the coordination time of Mike Riley, Melina Breland, and Tanya Vandenboss, I just want you guys to raise your hand. I know you don't want to speak or be recognized. But that team has been engaging around that individual. We've been successful in helping him achieve housing, achieve the resources needed, plug into community resources that can be an ongoing service provider for that individual. But because of the constant cycling in and out of emergency care and community care, he was getting lost. He just was not tracked all the way through those systems. And so that person has been stable now for 3 weeks? 3 weeks. So that in itself is a really big magnitude of resource that otherwise the fire department was left to just, continually try to manage.
How many calls a year?
For that person?
2016 it was 102, and 2017 it was 107. For a total cost of around $250,000.
So that's 1 every 3 days, and if you've gone 3 weeks without, that's pretty substantial.
The second one was a person who has a mental illness and some other challenges and was cycling through emergency department shelter, really cycling through the community at a really high frequency during the coldest spell that we had. And that team, myself, Jack, it took probably 6 of us one day to locate that woman. One part of it was at midnight and the other part was during the course of the next day, to locate her in the community and to contact the guardian office, contact the hospital, and really come at it from a coordination perspective that brings some visibility. And I think there's some frustration on the nonprofit partners' part, and I would feel this myself, I feel this for them, that there's been an effort to try to do this, but when you have so many people in the location, trying to pull out the resources for the very high need individuals is and of itself a job. And in this case, it was 6 of us one day, just focused on this. And so that woman is still housed, and she's been probably 2 weeks. And so I really believe that had we not found her, she would not have made it through that cold snap. And so just the tangibles that are coming out of this project, but also the lessons around the barriers that exist they're very real, they're very overwhelming, and really do take a team. We do have to come at this together, as this slide indicates. We have to all be working on the same page because of the level of advocacy needed. In that particular circumstance, the amount of work it took to engage our state partners was significant. And so that's a place where we can take a policy and community approach, and we can work from my office and from the other nonprofits to make sure that we're convening the state and we're convening people around these folks that are cycling through our emergency services and get them to the right resources.
Thank you, Ms. Burke. Yes, ma'am, didn't forget you.
I just think there's so many wins here that we need to celebrate, but more than celebrating the wins is that we need to document and take the data and present that data in a realistic way for you to make policy decisions. I don't know how long this intervention, this program is going to continue, but it would be nice if we could get, as a community, get information about the number of calls, the number, the changes that were made, the savings, and how we're reinvesting the savings, and really, truly, what the difference is making to the community. The community is feeling safer, the people at the shelters are feeling safer. It's just a win all the way around, and it's not something that should just be reported, because we should take it to the next level and add some real data to the numbers, to what's being reported, so that we have it solidified. So that's the request.
Thank you. I absolutely agree. Yes, sir.
Follow-up question, Lisa, for you, Sar. You mentioned the bag checks and the water bottles. In the event that during those bag checks your staff comes across drugs or drug paraphernalia, what are they being trained to do, and how are they going to handle that situation?
Sure, we're working with APD and with the CAP team on that. Most of the time, people, if they know they're going to be subject to bag search, they just won't come in. It's really kind of more of making sure people don't enter our facility with those types of things. If they do, there's a couple of options depending on what it is, right? So it may, if they've got a loaded handgun, that's going to be a different response than having a pipe. And we kind of have an escalation policy and training with staff. And again, we're working with CAP team and Jack, and everybody's been great. So, but really, it's to be a deterrent to not have those items on campus, and that you are subject to search, and you cannot bring, open unsealed water bottles into campus and into our facility.
I gotta believe it won't take long for that message to spread throughout the community.
Yep, that's our goal.
All right, thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and move on then to the HUD Funding Awards update.
This one came from the, when we were in the last assembly meeting, there was a question about the substantial amendments to have some more information about that. And then also a question regarding the change in the COC funding around resources for people with mental illness. So I think I'll let Steve address the funding first, and then we can go into the COC.
Thank you, and I don't have a copy of the PACE document in front of me, so I don't know what the questions were, but what that document basically did is it took some financial resources from the Community Development Block Grant Program and perhaps some other programs that we had allocated for a particular project. For instance, there was some money remaining from the Anchorage Senior Center on a capital renovation project there. We took that money and we report to HUD through the public process that we're going to reallocate that money to be determined future projects. So we pull it off of the books for the Senior Center and then reallocate it once we know who the next grantee is going to be. So a lot of that was just some cleanup of some funds that were remaining after capital projects were completed.
If I could pause you really quick, I just want the record to reflect that Mr. Steele has joined us. Go ahead, Mr. Ashman.
So unless there's a specific question, I don't know what else to say.
I was concerned that I have seen one entity kind of bleeding money, and we're pulling money away from them, and I don't know that it's proper for this venue at this time for this discussion. It might be better for off-the-record conversation, but it's really about what's happening with Anchorage Community Mental Health within the context of this service system, because their building has for lease sign. We just stripped $50,000 from them to reappropriate into other uses. And so when I see that kind of movement, it causes concern, because those entities, all of them have their part to play.
And I can talk about that particular one. We've been funding Anchorage Community Mental Health Services, at least since I've been here, so I think obviously before that also, but since 2014 in the amount of about $66,500. And originally it was in conjunction with their Pathways to Recovery program. And in that program and within our grant, they were working with us to identify the top 50 users of the Anchorage Safety Center. Deb Flowerdew, wonderful person, moved on and, from that organization. And then the Anchorage Community Health subsequently hired somebody else. But what we also were looking at is how we're overall in the community delivering those types of services and engaging individuals, and the creation of the mobile intervention team came about. And this is somewhat following the person that person that's funded with that grant is embedded in the with the CAP team at the police department, so the money's kind of following the person in this particular case. And Anchorage Community Mental Health has kind of changed their business plan. So we, back in last fall, put them on notice that this is what we were going to be doing. So that's how that came about.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on this, or is there anything else to report on that?
I think maybe this will just feed into the next one with the, with the change in Anchorage Community Mental Health's, they had a federal SAMHSA grant, which was the PAV grant, and they had the COC funds that you also referenced the change there. With that change, it basically meant that our outreach for mental health services in the community was gone. They're really, and in fact, right now, if we didn't have the CAP team mission going out with the CAP team. Rural CAP has recently started adding outreach in conjunction with the new SAMHSA grant that CITC has, but there really is, it's been kind of this series of having outreach, not having it, not having it, and then when ACMHS went away, that we lost a significant chunk of it for the community. The state has reported that they're attempting to have the PATH grant go to a new grantee, and they're working with a group called Choices, who also operates the Assertive Community Treatment Program. And if that is a viable, if Choices can pull that off, that would be a way to go, because you have an outreach, it's an outreach focused model, and you might have resources combining, but we've yet to hear if that's moving forward. But it's something that when we have this data dashboard, we should monitor what level of resource we have for these very particular outreach needs and how we're addressing it. So what happened with the grant, which was previously about 60 people were supported by Anchorage Community Mental Health on the resources from the HUD funding. When it switched over, there was a reduction in the number of people that were being supported who have a mental illness. And as that transition happened, the funds were being integrated into a broader perspective of the resources available for the entire community, and there will be some reprioritization of those funds to help us meet some of the needs of HUD, of youth that have higher levels of care needs, and potentially some others. And while that is the right thing to do, it comes at the same time that we have a reduction in outreach and resources for individuals with severe mental illness in the community. And we have this campus, things happening on the campus that clearly highlight that we need those resources. And so I just wanted to ask if Lisa Aquino, who is not the grantee, who's working on that part of it, the housing resource, but her organization is providing case management for that new configuration, if you could speak to that new partnership for us.
This is funding that comes through the COC, which the English Coalition in Homelessness, we are the COC, we award this funding. And with the change from English Community Mental Health that happened, there wasn't a lot of time, and so we're very grateful that NeighborWorks Alaska stepped up to do that. They are a tremendous partner, and we're really grateful for them. And then Catholic Social Services is doing the housing case management for them, and they're the housing support provider. Right now, that program, I believe the funding is it's about $269,000, and there's 45 clients currently housed through that. So it is less than the 60, but we knew that when we started, because that program had been going on for quite a while without necessarily, we have new oversight, and so we knew that we might be helping some of those folks transition to other kinds of resources for housing.
And just one last point on this. Anchorage Community Mental Health had for years talked about the fact that the PATH grant, they had been the grantee on the PATH grant since, I think, the 80s, the late 80s, and the grant never increased. It was $200,000 from day one to current time. So in effect, they had less and less resource to maintain the same level of effort, and probably the reduction is the really evaluating that and not having additional money to augment that service, which Anchorage Community Mental Health said that they always did. So the program wasn't sustainable, and I think the new reconfiguration demonstrates that that's true. So Anchorage Community Mental Health, perhaps we would have liked some more lead time to address the need for people with mental illness and outreach. I think they were finally making the adjustment that had been long overdue, that program wasn't sustainable, and so they closed it down.
Thank you, Ms. Burke. I have a couple of questions. Mr. Constant?
Yes, so the division has a new solicitation out for homeless peer support services. Are you up to speed on that?
I'm sorry.
The division has a solicitation up for homeless peer support services. Have you been following that at all?
I have not.
It's very generous. It's like $1 million a year. So it's definitely something we should be monitoring closely.
I might put someone on the spot right now and see if Beth might want to.
Susan's been working on it.
Oh, so there's not yours. So we will look at that.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Ms. Rose.
She answered my question. Thank you.
Okay. Great. All right. Anything else on that agenda item, Ms. Burke?
Thank you.
Okay. So we'll go ahead before opening it up to audience. Are there any final comments or questions from members of the committee?
Can't help myself. So the note that we should celebrate the success, I agree, but we should temper our celebration of that success. That I have neighbors that are consistently coming forward to say, wait a minute, it's not a total success. In fact, now I have 50 to 60 people that are flooding my part of the neighborhood. And so any celebration should be tempered with the fact that we have more work to do. We have to expand our scope to ensure that we're not just simply displacing and creating a whack-a-mole situation, but in fact at every point along the way we intend to intervene, intercede, and improve what we're doing. So I just want to make sure that's part of this conversation, because I know there are some interested parties here who are feeling under siege right now. So.
Thank you, Mr. Constant. Okay, seeing no others, we'll go ahead and move to audience participation. Because we have a little bit more time, I'll limit it to 3 minutes, and we'll start with Mr. Oliva.
I'm on Oliva, Clubside Auction, adjacent to Beans Cafe and the Brother Francis. I'd like to see those facilities closed. I didn't believe a word of what they said, and there's a lot of failure on their part to be responsible neighbors. That's an implied good thing, neighbor. They're not. They're adjacent property leaseholders. I think you asked a question about mail. They're receiving mail at Beans Cafe. It's an anchor for ballots. I think any anchor on that campus is wrong, especially a permanent mailing address, which the ballots total over 111. It'll compromise the election, potentially trading votes for a bottle of whiskey or whatever influence they have against the property owner who complains the most. I think a better location for mailboxes than receiving their mail is at the unemployment office to give them exposure to job opportunities. The idea of the overflow shelter, Mr. Peterson asked me if my facility was available. I said, come over and inspect. No one came over. The limit of the 24-month year-round cold weather shelter, year-round, not 45 degrees, was capped at $30,000. You already spent 24. I'm providing you with this of my appearance before planning and zoning that the conditional use that the Brother Francis shelter has, they cannot violate because no one can complain. The reason they can't complain is because code enforcement won't go down there. It gets turned over to the police, which were approximately 7,200 calls as of mid-August. So I have here 2 discs, planning and zoning, limiting, if not taking away, any possibility of complaining about the negative effects and their lack of compliance with their conditional use. The second video is of not only the mail issue, but also the land value issue, safety, quiet enjoyment, health, and basically economic interference. That documentation testimony by Mr. Tim Potter, the walking charter code book for this municipality, stated the negative effects. I want that to be part of the record, and for any references here, check that almost $5 million was lost in property valuation due to the stigma of the Brother Francis shelter and Beans Cafe. So come on down, take a look at the tents and the garbage. Nothing has changed with the captain being there because that was temporary. She has over a $2 million budget, a salary of $145,000, plus benefit package of almost 40,000. I want this committee to require that all nonprofits
If you can start wrapping it up, Mr. Oliva.
come forward with a financial statement and state their salaries. And that's required of nonprofits for IRS tax law. So let's look at where the money's going. Here's the disc.
Thank you, Mr. Oliva. Okay.
Would you have any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Oliva. Ms. Chase.
Yes. I'm with Rogers Park, Take Back Our Community Committee, and I have well, first of all, comment. I find it very disconcerting that we cannot get numbers that regular people can read. I've looked at the websites for various entities working on homelessness, and it's just like today, as Assemblyman Croft pointed out. Why present a HUD information to this committee, which is consistently, ever since I've been coming, and I know a lot of you have been coming a lot longer than that, but then why present a HUD document when it does not explain what the numbers are? I don't understand. And I mean, when you go on the websites, it is very difficult to figure out a whole lot of what is going on. Now, one item that Ron mentioned was about money. And when I hear and read about all of the organizations that have some effort in this homelessness and dealing with all the contingent challenges, I'm thinking, oh my gosh, look at all this money. And I believe that Anchorage is going to be contributing $1.3 million to this cause. So that's, we're paying it. And, you know, if you look at New York, Los Angeles, Portland, and Seattle, the amount of money that is being spent that nobody can really find out what's happening is astronomical. And it's just growing. I don't know what's happening here in English. I can't get that numbers. Okay, number 3, I want to ask a specific question. There's been a lot of talk about the rezoning of residential neighborhoods so that ADU attached dwelling units to homes. They're trying to rezone the whole thing so that there's no limit as to the size of the lot, and so someone could build a detached or an attached. And my question is, has there been any discussion about this rezoning? Who is pushing this rezoning from the Muni? And number 3, is there discussion that this is part of the plan of housing homeless people in Anchorage? And are there going to be municipal funds to, as I heard here today, you know, to assist in paying the rents of those facilities, so that if I decide, oh, I can build an ADU, I build it, and then the Muni says, I will pay 25%, but you have to agree to a certain length of time for this facility. Please tell me this is not true.
So, thank you, Ms. Chase, for your comments and question. I can tell you that none of that information has come before the committee, and that if you have questions regarding ADUs, I think the appropriate committee to go to would be the Community and Economic Development Committee, and they meet on Thursdays, but that's not something that will come before this committee.
So that is not on any plan at all? I mean, the reason for it, I don't even know what the reason for it is. The rezoning. And I don't think the general public realizes exactly what that means to neighborhoods. Has there been any discussion with your people about that?
I don't know who you're looking at. You're looking at me, no.
No, I'm looking at Nancy.
It's good speak to.
Nancy?
Do you want me to?
Sure, go ahead.
No. I was in attendance at Roger Park Community Council where that suggestion was made, but that's the first time I've heard it.
Okay. I'm hoping I can believe all this.
Yeah. Thank you. Any other comments? Sure, sir.
So, we spent quite a bit of time talking about homeless population that is very much in the public view. I would like to take a moment to thank this assembly. Some of the members of this assembly were members of the assembly when the assembly passed an ordinance that allowed organizations with facilities to have their facilities approved as emergency cold weather shelters. That ordinance was put in place and was utilized to help churches provide emergency cold weather shelter for families when the family shelters were full. And so over the last 7 or 8 years, these church facilities have been utilized each winter. Steve, since he's been an employee of the municipality, has helped us keep the church all of their applications current and their facilities current in cooperation with the fire department. I just wanted to report that there are 9 churches this year who are providing emergency cold weather shelter for families that would otherwise be out in the cold, faced with sleeping in unsafe places. And the last year, the last emergency cold weather shelter season, as we call it, from about October to May, when those temperatures are in that 45 degrees or colder, over 2,200 shelter bed nights were provided in the churches for family members in our city. And this year the number is a little bit down. We're not quite sure exactly why the numbers are down, but so far this year there have been over 675 shelter bed nights provided since October. So I want to thank the Assembly for the forethought and cooperation in making this possible. And I hope that the Assembly will kind of keep tabs on that and will support the administration in its efforts to help churches continue to be utilized for this. And that no policies are changed that would put them in a position where they are not able to function as emergency cold weather shelters. So I want to thank you very much for that.
Thank you. All right, we have time for one final comment. Go ahead.
ADUs, in 1985, it was part of the Title 21 discussion. And current Title 21, that was part of the discussion done before the assemblies, I don't know how many times. Every 3 or 4
It's been a few
years,
times.
It comes up, and it's just associated dwelling units on an R1, R2 lot. So and it's often called a mother-in-law apartment. And so that you can have an apartment for somebody else. In Los Angeles, they actually have a task force of people that goes out and tries to identify illegal ADUs because people turn their attached garages into accessory dwelling units. It's just in real estate, housing gets tight, rents go up, and it makes sense to turn an apartment or turn a shed, a garage, or something into a dwelling, and I think it's more of a zoning thing. And it's come up so many times over the years.
What he said. Yeah. Thank you. Sure.
Tom, originally when they were looking at it before, you'd have a 10,000 square foot lot. The new iteration coming down gets rid of that requirement at all. So any size lot would be able to have one that meets the requirements. So last time we looked at it was 10,000 square foot only, now they're reducing it.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and adjourn the meeting. Thanks, everyone.
They still have to meet setbacks, though, right?
You what?
Still have to meet. They changed the setbacks a little, but there are setbacks in it. It's getting everyone all riled up, but I think it's a relatively modest proposal.
But the problem is the project. In this scenario, yes. And we know right now